Welcome back, everyone. The time is now 5 p.m. in Seoul and 8 a.m. Greenwich Mean Time. Now that we've had a bit of a break, let us move on to session one. The topic for session one is borders and borderlands in the 21st century. Let me introduce to you the moderator and the presenters. The moderator for session one is Dr. Il-Chung-Lee. He's the Senior Research Coordinator of United Nations Research Institute for Social Development, also known by its abbreviation UNRISD. And the presenters are Dr. Chae-Han Kim, a professor at Hanlim University, Korea, Dr. Jonathan Goodhand, a professor in conflict and development studies, SOAS University of London, Dr. Patrick Meehan, postdoctoral research fellow at SOAS University of London, Dr. Nimmy, Korean, professor at the Center for Policy Research, New Delhi, India, Dr. Roland Blaker, professor of international relations, University of Queensland, Australia, and also Dr. Lily Murray, policy research and data specialist at Africa Borderlands Center, United Nations Development Program, Resilience Hub for Africa. Let us move on, and I will introduce to you Dr. Il-Chung-Lee. Dr. Lee, are you there? He's joining us live from Geneva, Switzerland. Dr.
Good morning. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. Welcome to the International Conference, Development, Environment, and Peace Nexus, or DEEPEN, Peacemaking in Borderlands. This conference is organized by Gangwon Province and Cheon County in partnership with United Nations Research Institute for Social Development, or UNRISD, and the People for Earth. I'm Il-Chung-Lee, Senior Research Coordinator at United Nations Research Institute for Social Development, the moderator of Session 1, Borders and Borderlands in the 21st Century. Since the Second World War, there have been at least 46 border conflicts. 32 of them occurred in the 21st century, and 3 of them are still ongoing. However, borderlands are not only the source of conflict, exclusion, and disasters. They can be the source of peace, inclusion, and ecological living only when you've changed your perspective and practices regarding the borderlands. In this session, together with 6 excellent speakers, we will discuss various issues related to borderlands and borders from this intention to change the perspective and practice. Before we start, I'd like to make several housekeeping announcements. First of all, this session is recorded and live streamed via the YouTube live stream channel, where the session recording will remain available afterwards. You can also find the recordings of other sessions there in case you missed them. As you can see in your YouTube channel, we have enabled comment section on the top right or bottom right, depending on your web browser. Please use the comment section for questions you would like to pose directly to one or several of our speakers, and put any general comments or information you would like to share with others. For the questions and comments put by others, you can use emoticons, likes button, to indicate your support for the questions or comments. It will help us to identify those questions and comments that most people would like to see addressed. At the very end of the session, in the comment section, we will also share a link to the concise 3-question feedback survey. We would very much appreciate it if you could fill in that survey too. Then, without further ado, I'd like to invite our first speaker, Professor Chae-Han Kim. Chae-Han is a professor of political science and director of the International Affairs Institute at Hanlim University, Korea. He's the founder of the Academy of DMG Sciences, which contributed a lot to researches on borders and borderlands in Korea and beyond. Professor Kim is with us today, but he prepared a pre-recorded presentation. Here we go.
I'm Professor Jae-han Kim at Hallym University, Korea. Today, I would like to suggest a conceptual framework of bordering. My presentation will be composed of two parts. First, I compare the pre-modern border, modern border, and postmodern border. And in the second part, I distinguish four types of borders or borderland by two criteria. Here are two circles. Actually, I drew them to the same size, but they look different in size because of different colors inside each circle. I marked the scope of jurisdiction in blue. The periphery or right circle is colored to pale over here. It means that de facto jurisdiction does not reach its uncolored periphery. Premodern borderlands may be expressed as the circle on the right, which looks smaller than the left one. This slide shows the characteristic of premodern borders. As you see, the premodern boundaries were rarely made clear. Even when the boundaries were defined, they did not work out well as real boundaries. Some periphery did not belong to any centralized entity. Most of armed clashes in peripheral areas were not just made between two central governments, but between a central government on one side and a local entity on the other side. These conflicts did not come from the fact the central governmental jurisdiction overlapped. Instead, the conflicts were over peripheries that were not controlled completely by any central government. In this figure of the modern era, nation-states have sought to expand their jurisdiction by making their boundaries clear. In modern border dispute, the issue of borders have been perceived a zero-sum situation between two centralized states. In the zero-sum situation, if one state wins an amount, then the other loses the same amount. This is contrasted with a non-zero-sum situation of pre-modern bordering, in which a periphery is shared by neither side or by both sides. In modern borderland, competition for national jurisdiction was fierce, and national identity was enforced. Some modern peripheries were not friendly to foreign nations. Modern borderland was the place where wars with the neighboring countries began. This modern nature of borderlands was not a path to peace at all. Even though some peripheries were forced to belong to a specific centralized nation, their residents did not feel a sense of belonging to their nation, and they tended to dismiss their central government as an outsider. This is because the interests of peripheries were not well represented by their central government. This figure symbolizes the postmodern border in comparison to modern as well as pre-modern ones. International flows are connected through borders, and various governance works across borders. National identities overlapped in postmodern borderland. The nature of overlapping may be a path to peace. Non-national actors such as international organizations and non-governmental organizations may work for peripheries. This change is called localization. With these three figures, we saw the nature of borders or borderland varies from time to time. Likewise, its relationship to war or peace varies from time to time. However, this order of time series sequence is not always true everywhere. The premodern, modern, and postmodern characteristics are mixed in current borderland. Therefore, to understand the current issues, we need a conceptual map of a borderland that includes all three eras. Now, let me talk about the second part of my presentation. 4 types of borders can be distinguished through 2 criteria. The first criterion is whether a borderland is edge of a political entity or the boundary between 2 political entities. An edge is far from the center of a decentralized entity. In the decentralized entity, center and periphery are distinguished from each other. On the other hand, a boundary distinguishes 2 different centralized entities instead of separating the periphery from each center. The second criterion is whether a border is a line or an area. A border as a line may be an impassable wall of a protected distinguishing between in and out. The wall controls their passage and protects against disease or other damage. On the other hand, a border has an area, maybe a passable route or window that mixes in and out. A border between warring neighbors may be called demarcation. That's the first type of border. Residents of a borderland often show adversarial attitude toward neighboring countries. These are observed in borderlands of ongoing wars or ideological confrontation, as in the internal Korean borderland. This is the phenomenon of demarcation. At the other end of a bordering characteristic, there are borders that maybe yield mutual interest by working as a path for human and ecological interchange. It is contrasted with the demarcation of exclusive ownership. Inhabitants of a periphery do not distinguish between their own nation and neighboring nations. The UNESCO Transboundary Biosphere Reserve contains sparse populations and they work as an important route for ecological values. The crown of a continent in the Rocky Mountains, where Canada and the US meet, is an example of a periphery. The International Sonoran Desert Alliance is another example of a periphery. The Sonoran Alliance is not a bilateral, but a trilateral or tricultural organization with a Native American reservation included. The mountainous Cordillera del Condor Peace Park and the oceanic Red Sea Marine Peace Park are examples of a periphery collaboration. Most peace parks in a remote area belong to the type of a periphery. Delimitation and march are intermediate modes of borders between demarcation as a strong border and periphery as a weak border. If a border is a clear boundary with a neighboring country, and the borderland differentiated from each national center, then it may be called delimitation. Western lands with a sparse population in the mountainous region of Central Asia have a clear borderline. They are an example of a delimitation. If a central government settles more people into a delimitation borderland in order to keep the borderline clear, then the borderland tends to take on a characteristic of a demarcation. The last type of border is march. If a borderland across boundary is not differentiated from its national center, then it may be called a march. Borderland under no jurisdiction over any state is not a march. Some rivers in southern Africa are de jure borders. However, there are frequent transboundary activities. Under this framework of bordering conceptualization, border cooperation is more likely in the free. Such actors as international organizations, NGOs, and local societies seem to play a more positive role in border cooperation than national government. Border cooperation is more likely to be achieved when local interests as well as global needs are satisfied. Such cooperation may ease confrontation between central governments. Buffer zones have not been established as a line, but an area. However, they do not work as a route at all. For instance, the Korean Armistice Agreement has fixed a military demarcation line, which is surely a sort of a demarcation. Some specific areas needed to be demilitarized in order to ease the linear confrontation between North and South Korea. The agreement has established a demilitarized zone, DMZ, with letting both sides withdraw 2 kilometers from the military demarcation line. The military confrontation along the DMZ has kept civilians out of the bordering natural ecology area. The Korean DMZ's ecosystem has been restored to its natural state through restriction on human access to it. Even the type of demarcation has some positive effect. The nature of bordering matters in peace, ecology, and development of borderland. What type of bordering each borderland should aim for depends on each given condition. It is necessary to analyze the cost and benefit of new bordering scheme in depth. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your excellent presentation on the concepts of borders and borderlands and their implications. Then I'd like to invite our second speaker, Professor Jonathan Goodhand. Jonathan is professor in conflict and development studies and SOAS, University of London, the UK. As a leading scholar in this field, he has been doing research on the political economy of the margins. Professor Jonathan Guten is with us today, but again, he also prepared pre-recorded presentation. Please start the presentation.
Firstly, I'd like to thank the organisers for inviting me to what promises to be an extremely exciting and interesting conference. And it's a shame I can't join you in person, but I hope there'll be future opportunities to do so. So, borderlands are commonly portrayed in policy and media discourses as marginal, disconnected and ungoverned zones that need to be pacified, incorporated and developed. What I aim to do is put forward a different perspective, which renders visible processes that are largely obscured in state-centric modes of analysis. In doing so, I want to present an alternative understanding of the margins in which borderlands can be seen as centres of innovation and laboratories of change. As Van Schendel has argued, methodological nationalism is associated with a set of ingrained state-centered reflexes linked to notions of fixity, stasis, and boundedness. These reflexes are deeply embedded in the development world, the development policy world, reflected in what I called borderland blindness. This is reinforced in the mental maps, the organizing principles of the policy-making industry, the division of the world into country teams, the location of country offices and capital cities, the national planning and budgeting processes, all of which contribute to capital city biases and a silencing of borderland perspectives. This leads to a particular imaginary of the margins as backward, lagging, conflictual, and in need of remedial measures. And this imaginary has two related functions. First, it justifies external interventions in the form of state building and development. And second, it conceals the distributional costs and consequences of such interventions for borderland populations. According to this logic, state building is presented as a process involving the steady diffusion of power outwards from the centre to the margins, while development involves the integration or incorporation of the margins through the extension of markets and the rolling out of development programs, something that David Harvey calls a diffusionist narrative. Our research as part of the Drugs and Disorder project calls into question this diffusionist narrative. The Afghan, Colombian and Myanmar borderlands are the focus of our research. All have distinct histories and development trajectories, but they also share some common features. They're dynamic trading spaces with booming frontier towns and inward investments in a range of licit and illicit activities, from casinos to mining to commercial agriculture. They are all also interventionary spaces, where different forms of counterinsurgency, state building, development, and counter-narcotics have been implemented and field tested. Far from lagging behind or being disconnected, they are extremely dynamic spaces linked into regional circuits of people, financial flows, commodities, and ideas. They're best understood as disruptive and transformative spaces, often at the leading edge of processes of political and economic change. And this leads to a hypothesis that we're trying to develop in our research, that the assumed pathologies of the margins, violence, insecurity, illicit economies, are less about the failure to integrate than a consequence of the precise ways in which these zones are connected to networks of state and market power. We contend that variation across borderlands in terms of conflict, governance, and development is a result of how these regions have been integrated into national, regional, and global political economies and networks, rather than their lack of integration. This relational approach focuses on how centres and peripheries are intimately connected and co-produced, often through a contested oscillation of power backwards and forwards between institutions and actors located at the centre, in the periphery, and across the spaces in between. And pivotal to these integrative processes is the role of brokers and brokerage. Brokers bridge spatial, political, economic, legal, and ideational synapses. They manage, filter, and direct flows of power, resources, and ideas that connect centres and the margins. So these dynamics I'm going to briefly explore now with reference to state building and development processes, drawing on our research. So borderland and frontier regions present particular challenges to the state and tend to be ruled differently from other regions. Frequently, they are places where sovereignty is contested, the means of violence is fragmented, and there's a long-standing insurrectionary tradition. State building is less about the monopolization of violence and the routinization of power than the franchising out or reallocation of violence rights to intermediaries so as to reconfigure political settlements and tilt the balance of power in favour of the state, but rarely definitively so. For example, in Myanmar and Colombia, the state has over many years operated in borderlands through militia or paramilitary forces, alongside the deployment of an admixture of counterinsurgency, securitized development, and counter-narcotics programs. Coercive brokerage provides a temporary fix to the challenge of frontier governance, but also it creates new contradictions and social impasses that require new brokerage fixes by the state. Over several decades of war and stuttering peace processes, the borderlands have experienced repeated moments of rupture and ongoing violence. This was less about the absence of the state than the ways in which the state sought to negotiate or impose rule in the periphery, leading to what might be called a functional disequilibrium or political unsettlement, involving a perpetual standoff between the centre and the margins. 3 points flow from this analysis. First, the margins are centres of experimentation and testing grounds for different forms of frontier governance. Brokerage fixes may be trialled in one borderland space and then transferred to another. Second, coercive brokerage and indirect rule, rather than being a transitional phase, part of an evolutionary process towards a varying state, may be seen instead as a more permanent and desired set of arrangements. Central state elites may have a strong interest in perpetuating liminal borderlands as sites of experimentation and extraction that can be ruled on the cheap. Third, frontier governance rarely remains quarantined in the borderlands. It has a tendency to travel and to rebound back in boomerang fashion into the centres of power. Political elites may find out that what works in the margins, exemplary violence, suspending the rule of law, working through brokers, can be deployed closer to home. And like a mutating gene, frontier governance may change the DNA of the central state. Frontiers have historically played an important role in the diffusion of capitalism, opening up new sites for demographic expansion, resource extraction, and investment. Frontiers and borderlands are, in a sense, special economic zones that have a comparative advantage in illegality due to several frontier traits: the fitful and contested presence of the state, the primacy of raw despotic violence in shaping claims and entitlements, the fragmented political and social landscape, and the role of the border as a zone of opportunity linked to gatekeeper incomes generated by price differences. In the borderlands we are studying, complex geographies of contraband, smuggling, and arbitrage sit alongside and are entangled with illegal resource extraction, frontier development schemes, and violent dispossession. They are quintessentially Schumpeterian frontiers, zones of creative destruction. They are places of adventure capitalism, windfall profits, boom and bust cycles, as exemplified by the drug-fueled frontier boomtowns of Zaranj and Muse on the Afghan-Iranian and Myanmar-China borders, respectively. Such ecologies of constraint and opportunity create both a need and the demand for brokers who can channel and direct flows, mediate claims, and manage conflicts in the absence of formal institutions to perform these tasks. Border zones are hyper-connected and extroverted spaces in which trading and economic relations are oriented outwards. These dynamics are rendered invisible by the borderland blindness already mentioned. Instead, an imaginary of the narco-frontier portrays unruly borderlands as a residual and delinquent, in need of ameliorative measures in the form of intensified development efforts to improve the connectivity of border regions so they can catch up and enjoy the fruits of globalization. Our research, contrary to this narrative, suggests firstly that illicit economies have productive and developmental effects in the borderlands and beyond. They're an important safety net, as well as a source of social advancement and inward investment, including infrastructure, illicit businesses, and public goods such as healthcare and education. The proceeds of frontier zones also flow into the property markets, banking sectors, and infrastructural development of metropolitan centers, including Kabul and Dubai, Bogota and Miami, Yangon and Kunming. Secondly, formal development efforts are not automatically an antidote to borderland pathologies. Our research shows that frontier development in the form of mining, commercial agriculture, infrastructure, and alternative development programs has been disruptive and extractive operating in the interests of foreign capital and state elites rather than borderland populations. Thirdly, as already highlighted, there is a symbiotic relationship between unruly liminal borderlands and the dynamics of investment and development in metropolitan centres. Maintaining frontiers as liminal spaces or special economic zones of intensified accumulation and dispossession is functional for a range of powerful actors in the borderlands and beyond. To conclude, I've set out the argument for a relational approach based on the idea that the character of the whole can be drawn sharply by attention to the edge. So peripheries are interesting places in their own right, but they are also privileged vantage points of understanding how power relations and markets operate at the centre, and how these are, at least in part, constituted by what's going on in the periphery. I've argued that borderlands are neither lagging nor disconnected, and that there is a need to better understand how the margins are integrated into global, regional and national political economies, focusing in particular on the role of brokerage in these integrative processes. Our research points to the forms of adverse incorporation through which the margins have historically been integrated into the networks of states and markets, and how these integrative processes continue to work to the disadvantage of borderland populations. Therefore, the development mantra of more state and more market is likely to reinforce rather than address the structural marginality of borderland communities and regions. There is a need for a more conscious analysis of the distributional effects in spatial terms of development policies and programs in border regions. Finally, I've argued that liminality and illegality may be functional. Illegible borderlands may be, for late developing countries, the equivalent of special economic zones. They enable processes of rapid accumulation that cannot take place elsewhere. To pursue the analogy further, if, as Ha-Joon Chang argues, late developing countries have had the ladder kicked away from them, do borderland zones constitute for the political elites of late developing states an alternative kind of ladder? They are places where state builders can pursue the unsavoury strategies of their European predecessors that are disallowed or at least moderated elsewhere by the mantras of good governance, human rights, and equitable development.
Thank you, Professor Jonathan Guten, for your excellent presentation. I think it demonstrated very well the problems of borderland blindness and state-centered approaches, and also the importance of alternative approaches to the margins, borders, and borderlands. Now, I'd like to invite our third speaker, Dr. Patrick Meehan. Patrick is postdoctoral research fellow, SOAS, University of London, the UK. He's co-investigator of a 4-year research project, which the previous speaker, Professor Jonathan Guten, briefly mentioned. Patrick is also with us today, but he also prepared pre-recorded presentation. Please start the presentation.
Hello everyone, my name is Dr. Patrick Meehan and I work in the Development Studies Department at SOAS. My research focuses on the political economy of violence, conflict and development, with a particular focus on Myanmar and its borderland regions with China and Thailand. I'm also currently working on a 4-year research project that is led by SOAS that is focusing on how illicit drug economies shape the dynamics of armed conflict and war to peace transitions across Afghanistan, Colombia and Myanmar. In my presentation today, I want to offer some reflections on how to better understand and address the challenges facing war to peace transitions through combining a political economy analysis of the challenges of peace building with a particular focus on how borderland dynamics shape these challenges. Since the end of the Cold War, conflict resolution and peace building have become essential components of Western development strategies, and there's been increasingly a shift from more traditional peacekeeping operations to more complex, ambitious and multidimensional strategies. In recent years, conflict resolution programs have sought to develop a more rigorous political economy analysis of how power is organized in society in order to better understand and try to address the drivers of armed conflict. Rather than a narrow technical focus on designing the right kinds of interventions or peace agreements, political economy analysis instead emphasizes that any intervention will be shaped by power relations and political interests and must be resilient to these pressures. This more critical political economy analysis has been really important, I think, in improving understandings of the stability of war to peace transitions and assessing whether post-war political settlements are likely to lead to more or less inclusive outcomes over time. However, a continuing weakness within political economy frameworks has been a failure to address the specific spatial dynamics of borderlands. This is despite the fact that borderland regions pose particular challenges for conflict resolution. Subnational conflicts with strong cross-border dimensions are the most widespread, intractable and deadly forms of armed violence in Asia, which is the area that I know best. Since the 1990s, these conflicts have affected half of the countries across South and Southeast Asia. And even in countries that are ostensibly defined as at peace, borderlands are often still chronically violent places with high levels of stability and human rights abuses. So addressing this paper aims to integrate some of the insights from political economy analysis with a more spatial focus on the particular dynamics in borderland regions. So I want to begin by building on a body of work that has been analysing the political economy dynamics of armed conflict and peace building, which I've been doing particularly alongside Professor Jonathan Goodhand, who is also on this panel. And through this body of work, we have argued that war to peace transitions are shaped by the interactions between three sets of dynamics. The first of these is the underlying configuration of power, or what is often termed the political settlement, on which a society is based. So this political settlement represents the formal and informal arrangements through which resources are negotiated and distributed. So these resources may be positions of power within government or informal institutions or business opportunities. And we argue that armed conflict is more likely to occur when this distribution of political, economic, and or social benefits within society does not reflect the underlying distribution of power. For example, in Myanmar, one of the fundamental drivers of armed conflict has been the tension between efforts by successive governments to create a highly centralized state system in which formal power and government institutions are controlled by political and military elites at the center, drawn from the country's ethnic Burman majority, and the fact that in reality sovereignty is highly fragmented throughout the country. This lack of power sharing creates a distinct disjuncture between the underlying configuration of power and the formal political system. The second key dimension of understanding war to peace transitions are processes of elite bargaining. And these refer to discrete agreements that explicitly set out to stabilize armed conflict by renegotiating the distribution of power and the allocation of resources between elites. And then the third part of these war to peace transitions are the formal peace agreements, these official arrangements that are entered into by warring parties to explicitly regulate or resolve their basic incompatibilities. External interventions have typically sought to support war to peace transitions through formal peace agreements aimed at regulating violent conflict, for example, through constitutional reforms, power sharing arrangements, formal elections. There are obviously a whole array of factors that shape the interrelationship between these three processes and determine whether conflict breaks out or not, which I don't have time to go into in this presentation, but I simply want to set out a broad conceptual framework for thinking through the different processes that are often at work around war to peace transitions. Within the work that I've been developing along with Jonathan Goodhand, one of our core arguments is that the trajectory of war to peace transitions is shaped by the interactions and the misalignments, or the extent to which there is alignment or misalignment between the underlying configurations of power, elite bargains, and formal peace agreements. In contexts, especially where formal negotiations simply don't reflect the underlying balance of power, either due to miscalculations or ideological positions or beliefs, then stabilizing armed conflict is likely to be really difficult. So just to give a very brief example, in Myanmar's peace process, what this framework emphasizes is the need to understand the interactions and the extent to which there is misalignment between the formal peace negotiations, these efforts to create a nationwide ceasefire and to launch the government's 7-step roadmap to democracy, alongside the ongoing forms of elite bargaining, especially between the country's democratic government under Aung San Suu Kyi and the military, and also the whole array of informal ceasefire arrangements between the government and various armed groups. And to keep an understanding of these processes alongside the underlying configurations of power that have been shaped by decades of armed conflict, very complicated war economies that are often rooted in illicit economies, the ongoing lack of formal power sharing, and the tensions between ongoing efforts by the military to consolidate and centralize control versus the ongoing strength that ethnic armed organizations have to resist these processes. And I'll come on to this a little bit more in the final section of my paper. What I want to move on to now is thinking through how this political economy analysis of thinking through questions of power, political arrangements, can come into conversation with a specific focus on spatial dynamics and the dynamics of power, particularly within borderland regions. Because one of the key arguments that I've been trying to develop in my work is that although development agencies working on conflict resolution have increasingly engaged with political economy frameworks and questions of power, the way that these frameworks are used continue to suffer from a number of analytical blind spots. And most importantly, I argue in my work, is that there is a need to bring these analytical frameworks more explicitly into conversation with approaches that address the particular dynamics of instability and conflict in borderland regions. So in order to do this, in the time that I have left, I want to set out a number of key starting points that I think are useful for policymakers to consider in terms of developing a stronger borderland lens to their work. First, there is a need to understand the importance of borderland regions in shaping underlying configurations of power. Quite commonly in the literature, borderland regions are often framed as marginal or lagging regions. You know, the focus on war to peace transitions is often what is going on at the center, around the negotiating table, often in national capitals. However, borderlands are highly sensitive spaces which offer distinct opportunities and challenges to competing elites. They're often central to narratives and anxieties of national identity and projections of sovereignty. Cross-border trade and investment can generate key revenue flows and rents. Cross-border networks and alliances with external patrons can generate key sources of power. So far from being marginal spaces, borderlands are often actually central to power relations and elite bargaining processes. Second, I think there is a need to understand the particular challenges that borderlands pose to ruling elites and efforts to establish elite bargains as a way of stabilizing armed conflict. That the challenges that borderlands pose can include long-standing histories of weak state control and contested legitimacy of state authority. The challenges of co-opting borderland elites into national coalitions or elite bargains, when the availability of cross-border sources of weapons, revenue, and support from external patrons give borderland elites significant power and disruptive potential. So forging stable elite bargains to manage violence can be particularly challenging in borderland contexts. And I think in these contexts, the risk of misalignment between formal peace arrangements and the underlying configurations of power are often particularly pronounced. Thirdly, there is a need to understand the dynamics of subnational bargaining processes, particularly in borderlands. Conflict analysis needs to engage much more effectively with the extent to which elite bargains and formal peace agreements at the national level are likely to stabilise or destabilise subnational political settlements, and vice versa. And this also requires a greater focus on the kinds of brokers and brokerage arrangements that mediate between national and borderland politics. Fourthly, I think a borderland lens is really important for also understanding how relationships between centres and peripheries themselves shift in war to peace transitions. There is often the assumption that once order is established at the centre, that this will provide the foundations for peace throughout a country's territory. In other words, that political order radiates outwards from the centre into unruly peripheries. However, in many countries, a level of stability and settlement at the centre continues alongside ongoing conflict and unsettlement in borderland regions. And understanding why this is the case requires centering borderland experiences and recognising that war to peace transitions and the prospects for peace can look very different when viewed from the margins rather than from metropolitan centres. For example, in Myanmar, much external engagement with the peace process since 2011 has been based on the assumption that opening up political space at the centre, through supporting the country's democratic transition, through backing Aung San Suu Kyi's Democratic Party, and by supporting the formal peace process, would provide the foundations for peace building throughout the country's borderlands. However, this approach really fails to take into account how the political transition at the centre in Myanmar and renewed violence in the country's borderlands since 2011 are closely connected. That the Myanmar military's decision to embark upon a national level reform process and peace process was founded in many ways on the army's consolidation of control over the country's restive borderlands and the stabilisation of the national economy through the 1990s and 2000s, which was based on cross-border trade and increasing resource extraction from borderland regions. These developments through the 1990s and 2000s gave the military confidence that they were now in a strong enough position to manage a transition on their own terms. And this enabled an elite bargain to emerge at the centre between the military and the country's democracy movement. However, these changes at the centre provided very few foundations for inclusive peace that addressed long-standing grievances in the country's borderlands. Indeed, for many ethnic armed organisations and borderland populations, processes of state building and borderland economic development since the 1990s were experienced in terms of ongoing forms of violence, militarisation, and environmentally destructive resource extraction, which enriched military elites but provided very limited sustainable development. And it's created very powerful scepticism amongst ethnic armed groups and borderland populations towards the rhetoric of ceasefires, political dialogue, and inclusive development that surround the formal peace process. So I think focusing and developing a stronger borderland lens helps to explain why armed conflict in Myanmar has broken out again in the country's borderlands at the same time as the launching of the formal peace process at the centre in Myanmar. So I'm running out of time now, so just to wrap up, what I've sought to do in this short presentation is try to emphasise the insights and the importance of political economy analysis for understanding the challenges facing war to peace transitions, and emphasising the need to focus on power relations and the tensions that often exist between formal peace processes, forms of elite bargaining, and the underlying configurations of power that surround conflict. but that in order to do this effectively, there's a need to develop a much stronger borderland perspective into international peacebuilding practice, and that this requires moving beyond state-centric frameworks. It requires a much deeper understanding of borderland regions as special political zones that can have a really powerful influence over national and even regional configurations of power. That these are places where formal structures, institutional arrangements, and peace agreements often demonstrate particular misalignment with the underlying configurations of power, and where armed violence is therefore particularly likely to arise. And I guess deploying a borderland lens also perhaps raises important questions about how development agencies can go beyond the statist approach that often defines their work. It may require changing the way the development industry itself organizes, which is often defined by division of the world into country teams, national planning, and budgeting processes. The focus on country programs that are developed out of national offices based in capital cities, all of which really limit often the understandings of borderland dynamics. But I will finish there because I think I'm running out of time. But thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Patrick, for your very interesting presentation. Your explanations about diverse pathways from war to peace must be particularly insightful to many policymakers who are thinking about the solutions to conflicts and violences. As I mentioned at the beginning, all those viewers can put your comments and questions in the comments section of the YouTube channel. Please do so whenever you have questions and comments on the presentations. Now we move on to our fourth speaker, Professor Nimmy Korean. Nimmy is professor at the Center for Policy Research, New Delhi, India. She also serves on the External Advisory Board of the India-China Institute, the New School in New York. Her research interests include Asian borderlands, federalism and foreign policy, transboundary commons, and comparative regionalism. Nimmy, over to you.
Thank you, Ilchung. Thank you, Ilchung. Greetings to everyone. Delighted to join all of you today for this exciting intellectual exercise to ask a different set of questions about borders and to look at fundamental framing questions about notions of space, place, and peace. And so I'd like to thank the organizers, UNRIST, and the people for Earth for convening this conversation and bringing us together today. So what the key question I'd like to engage with today is a fairly straightforward one. That is, to what extent is the border central to the developmental discourses being taken in its name by the Indian state? Well, the question may be straightforward, but the evidence is anything but that. What the evidence, in fact, throws up is a rather conflicted, very highly conflicted, convoluted, and oftentimes confused narrative that tends to pull in different directions, and is also an odd mix of a paradox and a promise rolled into one. So what I'll try to do in my presentation is try to unravel and unpack some of these layers and try to make sense of the politics behind these, the choices and contradictions that one sees at India's borderlands. So this is the region called as India's Northeast, incidentally a term which is deeply contested and deeply resented within the region, but it holds high currency among policy in policy circles, and from by the looks of it, it is here to stay. And one of the reasons why it's problematic is really because it tries to force fit, as it were, a region made up of 8 states with enormous diversity into this administrative catch-all category that has little resonance within the region. And it also happens to be a highly securitized region. In the corner, and this corner of democratic India happens to be in a permanent sort of state of quote-unquote state of exception. An example of this is the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, which was passed by the Indian Parliament in the 1950s and gives virtual impunity to the military, and has been enforced at different points in time in different parts of the region. And it also has a number of active insurgencies. So speaking of diversity, it is home to, as I said, immense ethnic diversity. It has over 400. It has about 160 scheduled tribes, over 400 tribal and sub-tribal groupings, and because of its location, it shares a 4,500 kilometer long international border with only a slender 22 kilometer long link with the Indian mainland. And it has about, in terms of the geographical area, it's about less than 8% of the entire geographical area of India. And its population is about 44 million. And as I mentioned about the securitized space, and in recent years we have seen several peace deals and ceasefire deals being signed between the government and insurgent groups. And it is also true that over the decades, violence levels have come down. But while the violence has dipped, now, what kind of peace it leaves behind is really a different question. So long story short, India's eastern borderlands is poised at a very interesting inflection point on several counts. So what does this developmental discourse say? Well, to begin with, it's a feel-good narrative, to be sure. It speaks a comfortable, cosmopolitan language of globalism, speaks of projecting the borders as bridges. And it is here that the state is stepping into its periphery, armed with a powerful new discourse of prosperity and an even more powerful arsenal of resources. And it is also taking a range of initiatives, sub-regional initiatives that are premised on the interesting idea of geographically proximate regions being sites of trans-border cooperation. And we see a veritable alphabet soup of sub-regional initiatives such as the BIMSTEC, the MGC, the BBIN, the BCIM. So it would then appear, at least at first glance, that the border is indeed at the center of this new emerging regional imagination. But I would like to question the taken for grantedness of this assumption and argue that the border remains paradoxically marginal to these developmental discourses that are being taken in its name. And the reason I say this is because there are, as I can see, identified 3 fundamental flaws due to which the border remains pretty much an outlier in this discourse. And first and foremost is the fact that it remains a capital-centric notion of space that really stands on its head the very idea of the border being the driver of this discourse. A very quick example. I mentioned the sub-regional grouping, the BIMSTEC. All the working group meetings of the BIMSTEC, for instance, be it on customs, health, disaster management, are firmly led and steered by Delhi, hosted by Delhi and held in Delhi, and not by by border regions, and not even held in border locations. Secondly, there is a central tension that one can see between entrenched geopolitical fears and this emerging feel-good geoeconomic hopes that tend to pull the border region, as it were, in different directions, and suspense the border regions in what the critical geographer Matt Spark calls as a sort of double vision. Thirdly, there are also one more reason why the border remains an outlier in this discourse is because there are virtually no institutional mechanisms of any sort for coordination between the federal and state policy actors. And interstate council, for instance, is a platform that is precisely designed to hold these sort of conversations, has by and large been dormant, and its meetings have been few and far between. In fact, what is bizarre is like some of these meetings get, the difference, the duration between these two meetings are sometimes, like 15 years. So it's like you have this complete institutional sort of gap at the heart of this discourse that is really resulting in a range of distortions that one sees at the borderlands. A quick example would be, take for instance the resumption of border trade, and which in actual practice becomes an exercise in what I would call choreographed trade. And this is a quick example of a border trade that where we did some amount of field work a few years ago. It's a place called Kalechar. It's on the India-Bangladesh border, and you have the resumption of border trade after 40 years. There's a great deal of fanfare, but as I mentioned, what actually happens on the ground is what I mentioned as choreographed trade. You have a pre-selected list of vendors and vendies, a pre-selected list of items to be traded, a cap on daily volume of business, and all to be conducted within a prescribed 5-kilometer long radius. So this is what I would call a classic instance of aiming low and hitting lower. Now, if we were to privilege this formal top-down...
Nimmy, could you wrap it up in 2 minutes, please? Sorry about this time constraint. But...
Okay, so now the reason why we get South Asia wrong is because we tend to look at this top-down formal reading, but this is, as I said, there's also missing half that we need to factor in. And how do we render this visible? It's by bringing scale into the conversation, by inverting the gaze to look at processes and practices at the borderlands and how border actors are leveraging location in innovative ways. So what exactly are these border actors doing? There are three emerging patterns that one can see. They're engaging the state, they're bypassing the state, they're socializing the state. The state as using it as a shorthand for national policy makers. And while they are doing so, they are acquiring critical transboundary governance functions, be it in trade, environment, health, tourism, and scripting success stories of their own from below. Quick examples: recent India-Bangladesh agreements on power trade and river trade, owe a lot of its success to the capacity of the border states to lobby the central government for a resumption of these ties because they are the direct beneficiaries. They occasionally also bypass the state. We have interesting examples of what could arguably be among the first sub-regional problem-solving models where sub-state actors reach directly across to break gridlocks. They also are fascinating examples of transboundary collective action which are filling governance gaps and creating regional public goods. We have a fascinating example of an India-Bhutan early flood warning system where villages on both sides of the border create these systems using WhatsApp. The long-term effect of these processes, as I see, is also the capacity to socialize the state it really opens the space for co-governance models. And we have an interesting set of examples in the social sector in cooperation between India and Myanmar in the health sector, where you actually see hybrid policy networks take place, where you so the quick takeaways. This is my last how do we make sense of these? So I would say no desecuritization blueprint can succeed without the participation of the border actor. You cannot hope to choreograph this from distant capitals. And what is also the other takeaway that one can see is that there are a cluster of often competing agendas clearly at work. And because of the unresolved contradictions and tensions that I mentioned earlier, this could well create new centers and new peripheries, to borrow William Callahan's evocative phrase. So the nature of the piece that gets produced or generated will always be a highly contingent one as a result of that. Thank you.
You're muted, Il-chong.
Sorry, I was muted. Thank you very much for your insightful presentation, Nimmy. I think the stark contrast between the rhetoric and the reality is a problem you often come across regarding the issues of peace and cooperation always. Now, I'd like to invite our fifth speaker, Professor Roland Blaker. Roland is Professor of International Relations at the University of Queensland, Australia. In his research, he examines a wide range of issues such as security, humanitarianism, and peace building, with a focus on the role of aesthetics, visuality, and emotions. In particular, Roland served as Chief of Office of the Swiss delegation to the Neutral Nations Supervisory Commission in Panmunjom between 1986 and 1988. For those who watched the Korean film JSA, in which Korean actress Lee Young-ae played the role of Swiss Army officer Sophie, he is the real figure of Sophie's boss. Roland is with us today, but he also prepared pre-recorded presentation. Please start the presentation.
Dear viewers, my name is Roland Blaker, and it is a privilege to participate in your conference on peacemaking in Borderlands. I'd like to start by thanking the organizers of the conference, the United Nations Institute for Social Development and People for Earth, and in particular, Erin Hung, Samuel Brülisauer, and Dr. Il-chong, who of course is also chairing this panel. What I'd like to present today is reflections drawn on my own experience of working in Borderlands, in particular in the Korean demilitarized zone, and on my own photographs I took during this experience. I worked in the DMZ almost 35 years ago, and I reflect on these experiences and on the subsequent sort of decades of engagement with Korea and Borderlands in Korea. That's what I have in mind. I will try to address the key questions you're posing in this panel around the relationship between Borderlands conflict and pathways to peace. And in particular, I want to ask, what can visual autoethnography contribute to rethinking border politics and security dilemmas? Now, visual autoethnography is a method I depict or I present as a way of drawing on one's own experiences and on one's own photographs. So during the presentation here, I draw on photographs I took in the mid-1980s in the DMZ and on my own experiences. And the first question, of course, is why should my own experiences matter? Why should my photographs matter? You know, is it just self-indulgent? You don't care about my experiences. My experiences in that sense should only matter if they help us directly rethink border politics and security. And in that sense, I'm trying to convince you that my experiences, even though there's some of them lay decades back, they can still matter today, and they can help us rethink security politics. I'm not going to pretend my photographs of the DMZ, my photographs of North or of South Korea are somehow authentic or give us unique insights. Much rather, I'm going to try to use my photographs as tools to rethink border politics. What I'm going to try to argue is twofold. The first argument I'm going to try to make is that a self-reflective engagement with my own photographs taken decades ago can reveal how deeply entrenched discourses of militarized masculinities are in the borderland in Korea, and how deeply they shape security politics on the peninsula. And by doing so, I want to try to open up ways of rethinking security politics by sort of going beyond this discourse of militarized masculinities. And the second kind of argument I want to make is a dual need for an ethics of dialogue, of talking across difference, across the DMZ, across the borderlands, but also an ethics of difference. And that is an ethics that accepts that dialogue is always going to be stuck. There's always going to be limits to dialogue, and that we need to accept these limits. We need to accept that basically North and South Korea have become places that are different in identity practices, different in political practices, different in psychological practices. Now, I hope these two arguments are going to become clearer as I move on in my presentations, but I want to give you a bit of a sense of what lies ahead. I will, by making these arguments, I'm drawing on a couple of recent publications and older publications. One is an essay in the European Journal of International Security on visual autoethnography. That's the main one I draw on. A book on visual global politics, where I develop particularly the visual dimensions of what I present today. And an older book on divided Korea towards a culture of reconciliation with the University of Minnesota Press, where I develop in much more detail the issue of an ethics of dialogue and an ethics of difference. Just sort of for transparency, this is what I will be drawing on. Now, of course, you are meeting in Korea, so I don't have to give you a background to the Korean conflict, to the division of Korea, and the borderland in Korea. I spent 2 years in Panmunjom from 1986 to 1988 as a Swiss military officer, as a member of the Neutral Nations Supervisory Commission, the Swiss delegation to it. Now, the NNSC was formed in 1953 at the end of the war in the context of the armistice in order to supervise the armistice. By the time I arrived in Panmunjom in 1986, the Swiss delegation has shrunk to 6 members, and we were working with the Swedes, the Czechs, and the Poles. This is a photo here in Myeongdae at Kim Il-sung's birthplace, and I'll let you guess which one of the handsome young men is me. Now, part of the fascination of this job was the ability to travel back and forth between North and South Korea, in addition to actually living in the DMZ. To me, that sort of shaped my interest in Korea for many, many years, and that's why I've never given up. I've often returned to Korea in subsequent years. I taught in Korea at some point at Busan Daeakyo, and I have done some research on Korea, although I'm not a Korean specialist. Now, one of the first impressions I had when arriving in the DMZ in the mid-1980s was the extremely delineated borderland. This is the view from a bedroom window right onto the military demarcation line. There was virtually no interaction between North and South back then. It was the Cold War. It was an extremely hostile environment. And we members of the NNSC were one of the very few people being able to go back and forth between Kaesong and Seoul, or Pyongyang and Seoul. So an extremely tight borderland. But what I want to sort of present today is, from my experiences, is that the borderland in Korea, in my view, is not even most importantly, a delineation of space, of geography, of physical borders. it is just as much a delineation of thought. It has to do with how borderlands shape our mental, psychological, political, ideological kind of interactions. And that's what I want to sort of present here today. And I'm going to make two arguments as I flagged. The first one is about the militarized masculinities that exist in Korea's borderland. Now, arriving in the DMZ, one of the first things one notices, of course, is the demilitarized zone is not at all demilitarized. It is a highly militarized zone, and militarization is performed in many ways. So across the border, you will see North and South Korean soldiers facing each other. In many ways, the interesting thing is this is an extremely divided country, but in other ways, the two sides are very, very similar. Men in uniform. You know, if one is familiar with the Korean situation, one sees these are UNC, United Nations Command officers, South Korean American officers. These are North Korean officers. But from a bit of a distance, these just look like men in uniform. So there's in many ways almost as many similarities as dissimilarities. Now, I scanned these photographs from 30, 35 years ago recently. And when I scanned them, one thing that stuck out immediately for me, I'm a feminist scholar, one thing that stuck out immediately here is in almost all of my photographs, they're only men. You know, there's like South Korean men, there's North Korean men, there's American men, there's Chinese men, there's only men. I found very, very few photographs featuring women. This is one of the few I found at a military armistice meeting in the Joint Security Area in Premodern. This is the building where my office was located in. Now, on some level, this is not surprising. One would, of course, expect to find men in a context of a militarized area. But what I found particularly interesting is not so much that today I noticed this masculine sort of area. The fact I found interesting was that 35 years ago, when I arrived in the DMZ, I noticed everything about the DMZ. I noticed the extreme division between North and South. I noticed the ideology. I noticed the nature area. I noticed everything except the lack of women, except the militarized masculinities that is absolutely essential. And I'm thinking back now and I'm asking myself, why did I not see that? What did I miss? How could I not see the most obvious aspect that to me here sticks out immediately? And of course, I was born in Switzerland. I grew up in Switzerland in a highly patriarchal society. Swiss women in some cantons were not given the vote until the 1970s. You know, I was drafted into the military. I was taught how to shoot a gun, how to throw a hand grenade, how to drive a tank, but I was not given any sensitivity in terms of gender relations. And that to me is where power is at its most effective, when it is so obvious, so naturalized that we don't even see it anymore. And to me, this is one of the key problems on the Korean Peninsula in terms of security politics, is that this sense of militarized masculinity is so deeply entrenched and shapes the conflict so much that we cannot see outside of it. Now, we see the conflict only as a militarized conflict. And as a result, we also see solutions only as militarized solutions. And we sort of limit our ability to think innovatively about how we could possibly solve the conflict because we are caught in this way of thinking about borderlands, thinking about conflict, and thinking about pathways for peace. So I think the first point I want to make here, the first argument is that to think innovatively about moving ahead, we need to break free from seeing the Korean conflict only as a conflict that can be solved through security mechanisms, sanctions, militarized threats, and so on. So we need to think more innovatively about it. The second point I want to make has to do with a different aspect of my experience. You know, I look at my photographs today, and I realize in this one, this is photographs when I hang out with North Korean and South Korean officers, I realize that I'm looking a lot more relaxed with South Korean colleagues than with North Korean ones. And I realize, and I did so very early on, that there's no way I could be neutral in the Korean conflict. You know, I grew up in Switzerland during the Cold War, and in the Cold War, everything was black and white. You were either Western democratic or you were Eastern communist. There was no middle ground. And that's how I felt arriving in Korea. I found South Korea fascinating. On the weekend, we could stay in Seoul. I traveled a lot through South Korea. It was all very different, very strange, but I felt in my world. I didn't feel in my world when I was in North Korea. It was a different world. It was a world that was divided, and not just for me, but for everyone else. You had to really commit on which side you were. This is the sign here in Camp Boniface in the UNC compound in the DMZ that says "Forever in front of Mall," in front of the evil communists. And this is how the world presented itself also when I look at my photographs. My photographs of North Korea show an entirely different world, and a world, of course, here dominated by communist architecture, a world dominated by the presence of Kim Il-sung. He was still alive back then. A world, in some sense, of hardship, of poverty, but also a world of everyday life. And in my essay on visual ethnography, I say a lot more about that. So one could spend a lot of time sort of commenting on these visuals of North Korea, but they contrast very much to the images I have of South Korea. Just look at these two. This is Pyongyang. This is Seoul. Seoul, a cosmopolitan city back then in the 1980s already, gearing up to the Olympic Games. Here is the clock counting down the days to the Olympic Games in Seoul. A democracy, or rather an authoritarian regime in the process to democracy. I witnessed the massive demonstrations in 1987. So what I want to say here is that basically these were two completely different worlds, and couched in a language, a political discourse, an ideological discourse that was extremely hostile. Basically, to be South Korean meant not to be North Korean. To be North Korean meant not to be South Korean. So based on these experiences and research I've done afterwards, I wrote a book about a decade after my initial 2 years in the DMZ on basically pathways to reconciliation in Korea, called Divided Korea Toward a Culture of Reconciliation. And there's two arguments I try to make in that book, which I want to sort of very, very briefly summarize here. The first one is a fairly obvious one, is the need for an ethics of dialogue. That is, we can solve the Korean conflict not just through threats and sanctions to North Korea, not just in militarized terms, but we need to open up dialogues across the DMZ. And as I said, the DMZ in the 1980s when I was there was completely sealed. There was virtually no one going back and forth except us Swedes and Swiss and Czechs and Poles. So the ethics of dialogue would mean opening up interactions between North and South. This is, of course, the whole idea of the so-called sunshine policy initiated by Kim Dae-jung and then continued by Roh Moo-hyung and sort of practiced in various ways during subsequent administrations or not. The idea to have exchanges of like economic interactions, to open up a train line, tourist visits to North Korea, family exchanges, sport exchanges, all kind of interactions that I think are symbolically very important and that help to dismantle this kind of image of the evil other side. So I think an ethics of dialogue in that sense, hugely important and should be promoted, and I think is a key to overcoming these militarized masculinities that have come to dominate the conflict. But I think want to stress that it's also important to promote an ethics of difference. That is, to recognize that dialogue, no matter how important it is, no matter how widely it's practiced, is never going to be able to kind of do everything. There's always going to be something left. There's always going to be differences left. North and South Korea have been divided for over half a century now. Now, of course, Korea had been unified for many centuries before, but over this half a century of division, North and South Korea have developed very different identity practices. Not just because they're embedded in different ideologies, communism, Juche in the North, and sort of democracy, capitalism in the South, but because they have developed very different ways of living, of interacting, of speaking. Simply the Korean language, as you know, is such that as soon as one opens one's mouth, you know exactly whether you're North and South Korean. There's different terms for for Korea, different terms, different ways of interacting, different uses of characters in terms of the Chinese characters. So one of the key things, I think, to avoid conflict is to recognize that North and South Korea have developed different forms of identity, and there have to be space for tolerance, space for acceptance of these identities. Now, there's no way I can go into detail on these two aspects, as I've written a whole book on that, but I wanted to sort of flag these and hope we can perhaps discuss them in the discussion period in more detail. So to wrap up, what I sort of thought that my visual autoethnography can contribute, and again, I've tried to show that my experiences from 30, 35 years ago in the DMZ are not just something of the past, not just something personal, but I've tried to use them, as well as my photographs, to rethink borderlands, interactions across borderlands, conflict and peace in two ways. First, by revealing the deeply entrenched militarized masculinities that have shown or have shaped the conflict. And in some sense, my own confrontation with my photographs reveal how deeply entrenched that they are. That very often we don't even see them anymore. And I think that's something that needs to be done first, to kind of really see beyond them and to look at the conflict in broader ways and look at solutions to the conflict, to interactions across the border in broader ways. And then, as I've just outlined, the dual ethics, and ethics of dialogue and an ethics of difference. And again, this has been very short, but I hope we have the chance now, after our presentations, to engage in a dialogue with each other about the different ways through which we can think about borders and think about innovatively about solving the conflicts, or at least preventing conflict from emerging and perpetuating across these borders. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your very interesting presentation, Professor Lulang Blake. I could find a handsome young man in that photo, and I hope I was right. Now we move on to our last speaker, Dr. Lily Murray. Lily is the Policy Research and Data Specialist with UNDP Africa Borderlands Center. She's a Program Management Specialist with a vast experience in a wide range of fields such as inclusive evidence-based programming, program assessments, and action research. Over to you, Lily. Could you keep your presentation to 13 minutes or less than 13 minutes to have more discussion time? Thank you.
Thank you. So good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are watching. As introduced, my name is Dr. Lily Murray, and I work with the Africa Borderlands Center, UNDP Resilience Hub based in Nairobi. My presentation, I will present to you insights from the Africa Borderlands. So I will touch on a brief introduction. I'll also touch on opportunities and challenges in Borderlands, our intervention as UNDP, and our center's approach, and then I will end with some concluding remarks. By definition, borderlands are those territorial margins of national states. And these borders actually, the border contact is a central feature of the economic and political life. It is also estimated that over 250 million inhabitants live in these borderlands. And of course, these borderlands communities are some of the world's most creative spaces and demonstrate enormous resilience. In addition, these communities in Africa Borderlands have a great potential to contribute to the continent's prosperity of peaceful development. Now, in terms of the opportunities and challenges, it is appreciated that the socio-economic and political, including the ecological activities happening in this, happen beyond borderlands and also impact those living in the borderlands. These borderlands are also underserved by national institutions, and in most cases, this is reflected in lower human development, unemployment, and also poverty indices.
Lily, I think the viewers cannot see your presentation file, so could you share your slides by using sharing screen function? in Zoom?
Sorry for that. Let me start again.
No, it's okay. I mean, you go on, but you have to share the screen. It will be better. Yeah, we can see it now. Okay,
Great.
move on, please. Thank you.
Yes, so I will just go to the slide where I was, and I was just saying that these communities in Africa borderlands have a great potential in contributing to the continent's prosperity and also peaceful development. Economic, socio-economic, political, and ecological related activities impact broadly on those living in the borderlands. And again, these borderlands are actually underserved by national institutions, and this is reflected in lower development, unemployment, and also poverty indices. These borderlands too are conflict prone and majorly are host to some of most prominent violent extremist groups. In addition, we also see that youth alienation is acute in borderlands, and these youth actually experience a lack of education, marginalization, and experience extreme poverty. Women too in these borderlands suffer the effects of underdevelopment, and in most cases they are found to perform multiple roles both at home and to a large extent in the informal economy. Despite these challenges, we appreciate that the borderlands are creative and resilient communities amidst the complex development and security challenges. They are also innovative in terms of responding to these difficult circumstances where they only work with very limited resources. Also, insecurity and to a large extent poverty have disguised as a true economic potential. However, in improved circumstances, these borderlands communities could thrive because we appreciate that they have natural and human resources that they possess and they could actually potentially use to be able to get out of these development and security challenges. What is the intervention therefore? As the UNDP development program, by also understanding this multidimensional approach and vulnerabilities, the UNDP developed the Africa Borderlands Center as a flagship for the UNDP Regional Bureau for Africa. The center is designed as an expert resource of intelligence, also to provide expertise through experience, and this is done through research, policy, and providing programming advisory support. The major aim of the center is to support national governments, intergovernmental agencies, UN agencies, development partners, and even other key stakeholders to implement effective programming and also contribute to the commitment of leaving no one behind. We have two approaches. One is the research approach that is anchored in the principle of thinking better. This is where when we generate knowledge, we use it to deploy innovative approaches to address the challenges in the borderlands. And this we deploy using the horizon scanning, thematic-based research, and also solution mapping. In addition, we also collect lessons and good practices, and to be able to also deploy that and replicate and scale up of good practices within these borderlands. Again, we use the results from mapping, and we are able to test and deploy inclusive responses as well as interventions to be able to address the challenges in the borderlands. Our other approach is the technical and policy advice, and this is majorly to support country offices, stakeholders, and even borderlands authorities to be able, as they design and implement projects, to include borderlands issues. Again, on issues of policy advocacy, we want to engage stakeholders and encourage the integration of borderlands key issues into both continental documents as well as frameworks. And also, in terms of working with UNDP Development Program country offices, with governments to encourage them ensure that national development policies, national plans, as well as key sectoral plans also take in place and consider issues regarding borderlands. Last but not least, we are also looking at strengthening partnership and relationships between UN agencies, UNDP and governments, other partners, as well as donors in support of borderlands, and also reaching out to research think tanks and academia to be able to come up with research and results that inform development in the borderlands. In conclusion, therefore, and appreciating that the borderlands are some of the most creative spaces, it is important to look at this in a way of partnership. So we are therefore calling for partnership and shared prosperity. This taking an approach of inclusive research, policy and development pathways, and also judicious use of technology so that we are able to deploy peace and sustainable development in the borderlands. Secondly, we're calling upon investing in new technologies, new methodologies, concepts, and practices, and also infrastructures for peace and development. And this, we are calling upon the partnership, all of us, to do it in a way that we support the voices and the potential for those living in the borderlands. As well, directing more resources and attention to be able to understand the causes and effects of conflicts, and more so to invest in prevention and mitigation, including peace building. Therefore, by applying a multidimensional approach for intervention in borderlands, considering this crisis and solution-oriented approach towards peace and development and harmony, we believe that we'll be able to reach out to borderlands and leave no one behind in these regions. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your excellent presentation, Dr. Lily Murray, and I wish you the best of luck, and best of luck to your institute, Africa Borderlands Center too. We have listened to all 6 presentations now, and we asked conference participants to put the key questions related to the theme of the conference and found some questions quite relevant to our session. They are as follows. Do you distinguish between flexible frontiers and fixed national borders? This is a question from Wolfgang Pipe of Belgium. And the next question is, how do traditional national institutions create cross-border linkages? This is a question from Fred Coccozelli of the United States. And third question is, how does border imperialism scale with this focus on peace? This question is from Patricia Rodriguez from the United States. And the next question is, how do the development of borders or borderlands and their appropriation by different groups transform conceptions or concepts of geopolitical territory? This is a question from Chris Romanos of the Netherlands. And how can he communicate and come to a mutual understanding about what peace may mean for borderlands? This is a question from Yuli Kim of the Republic of Korea. And we have several questions from the floor too. One question is about the concept of boomerang effect, which is directed to Jonathan. And the other question is about the kind of oriental connotation of the mapping of borders, directed to Jonathan and Meehan. And another question is about the kind of implication of recent trends to build up borders with walls. I mean, you can find it in the United States and all that. And what is the implication of that trend or policy? So maybe you can pick up some of these questions and answer those questions. And we have around 20 minutes. So who would want to go first? Probably, Jonathan, you can go first because there are several questions directed to you specifically.
Okay, I'll be very, because we don't have much time. I don't want to take up everyone else's time, but I'll have a go at addressing the boomerang effect question, and also this question about, well, what's different about Borderlands in the developing world versus the Eastern Europe, and the developing world and the developed world obviously are problematic terms anyway. But firstly, on the boomerang effect, and so what we're arguing is frontier governance, which is trialed and tested on the margins, can rebound and have impacts on the center, and we're playing with this idea, changing the DNA of the central state. And there's a long history of these processes. Hopkins writes about this in relation to the history of imperial powers and how they dealt with unruly frontiers, and a kind of a frontier governmentality emerged that was transferred across different colonial imperial contexts, but also arguing that it also had an impact about how these imperial powers governed at the center. So just to give one or two quick examples how this might work, and I think this is something that needs more research on our part. Firstly, the militarization of border zones has an impact on the salience and the political importance of the military at the center. And I also do work on Sri Lanka, and the way the Sri Lankan state dealt with its frontier regions in the north and east of the country heightened the political and the military significance of the military. And then there was a rebound effect in terms of the kinds of governance at the center, including suspension of kind of human rights, targeting of forms of dissent at the center. Another example of this is kind of more the kind of the imaginary and this kind of the discourses around nationalism. So the nationalist discourses can emerge from the periphery, and then they get strengthened at the center. And so the margins, in a way, are where nationalist discourses spring from and reshape political discourses at the center. There's lots of other examples I could give, but I think there is something there about this recursive relationship between the center and the periphery, and the oscillation of power and of discourses backwards and forwards. Very quickly on the difference between the borderlands we've been looking at and Eastern and Central Europe. Well, obviously this is not an area that we are studying, but I think one of the differences must be that the places that we're looking at, we have these kind of frontier dynamics and kind of very liminal borderlands, and the state rules indirectly through brokerage. That will be much less the case in the Eastern European context, where you have the infrastructure, the power going right up to the border. But I think you do have some interesting border dynamics going on, because the presence of that border creates this border effect and incentives to transgress it in terms of smuggling and so on. And there's processes of debordering and rebordering going on across Europe, with the exporting of borders to the outer reach margins of Europe. So it's not that borders have disappeared, or they're moving, and there's a multiplication in many ways of borders. But I'll let others have a go at answering questions as well.
Thank you. Patrick, do you have anything to add to what Jonathan just said?
I thought I'd take one of the other questions that came up from Yuli Kim about what are the ways to communicate and understanding about what it means for Borderlands. I think this is in many ways a theme that has come across a lot of the presentations in this panel, and a lot of it is emphasizing the need to look at peace building and peace processes from the perspectives of the margins. I think a lot of what the putative margins, the way that they're framed, that it's taking critically a lot of the narratives around peace building and development are emphasized, that often emanate from the center. And this can be developed through a lot of work in terms of actually working with local research partner organizations in Borderlands, trying to find active ways of integrating marginalized voices into these discussions. That in the work on the project that we've been doing in Myanmar and across Afghanistan and Colombia, it's involved a lot of active field work in borderland regions of trying to capture the voices and the perspectives of people in these areas. And that also requires an acknowledgement that these voices are discordant. There are many different perspectives. There's not necessarily a one single borderland perspective on peace building or on development, but it requires much more of a sustained engagement with trying to support having marginalized voices, having a seat at the table, and having a chance to engage with some of these debates. And I think once you do that kind of work, you see a lot of the limitations and the platitudes around some of these narratives around development and peace. In some of the work that we've been doing in Myanmar, a lot of the people that we're working on within Borderlands sort of frame that development has become a dirty word in some of these areas, that for them it's linked with forms of environmental degradation, dispossession, militarization, that is often missed when you see these much larger sort of national or global narratives around Borderlands as new economic corridors, new ways of providing prosperity and development. And I think it links a little bit back perhaps to what Jonathan was saying as well, around needing to have a clearer understanding of the distributive impacts of peace building and development, that this can often bring quite significant sort of progress, economic development, but it's looking at how the costs and benefits of that are distributed across territories, in ways that often concentrate the benefits in terms of new flows of capital investment into regional centres, but at the cost of worsening forms of insecurity and precarity in borderland regions. So I think a lot of it is, I guess, what also myself and Jonathan were trying to hint at, about also thinking the way that the peace building sector is currently structured, that often serves to sort of prioritise sort of capital city bias, in which Jonathan calls it, and often ends up filtering out a lot of these more discordant narratives. So I'll stop there, but I think it's quite an important point in terms of methodologically as well as conceptually how you actually work hard to try and capture perspectives in non kind of majority languages, perspectives that are often marginalized and often quite difficult to reach populations.
Thank you very much. Laurent, do you have anything to add to what was previously discussed, or answer any question from the questions we drew from the registration or floor?
Look, maybe just given that we don't have much time, just one point. There's lots of really interesting questions, but what I find interesting is how the 6 presenters sort of seem to approach them somewhat differently. So we have on the one hand sort of Drs. Kim, Goodhand, and Murray, who sort of almost look through a macro approach that looks at big global patterns or regional patterns of how borders work in economic ways, in political ways, in social ways. And then we had the presentations by Drs. Kurian and Meehan and mine that look at very specific cases, you know, like Korea, India. And I think we need both to kind of look at things. We need sort of macro approaches that show us that borders are not just these lines on a map. They're really a lot more complex. They involve a lot of processes, but we also need to understand how they function in very, very concrete empirical contexts. And I think to answer some of these questions around link between flexible and fixed borders and all of institutions, we can make general sort of statements, but ultimately I think we have to look at how in a very particular context, what is happening in a cultural, historical, political context. And that to me is sort of the key point I find interesting, that we need both macro, micro approaches general theoretical ones and empirical studies. And I think the panel was a very nice combination from different scholars from different regions that did both of these things.
I have one question to you if I abuse my role as a moderator. I mean, what would be the one key difference between Korean border and other borders in other countries? And what would be one similarity, key similarity between these borders, which can give us some insights and, you know, policy solutions to deal with different problems in South Korean borders and other borders in different parts of the world?
Was that to me or to everyone?
Yeah, to Laurent. I mean, because
okay,
you
sorry.
have an experience.
Yeah, look,
you have
I mean,
experience about South Korean borders.
I would say two things. One is Korea is a lot more hermetically sealed than many other borders. You know, it's today more open than it was when I was there in the 80s. In the 80s, no one could cross. Like we sort of 6 Swiss and 6 Swedes were the only ones being able to cross. Today, there's some interactions, but compared to most other borders, it's very sealed. The similarities, I would think the first point I made around militarized masculinities. Now, we look at a lot of politics, security issues in very militarized way, in very masculine ways. And as a result, we really limit our capacity to think innovatively about how to rethink conflict, how to find different solutions. And I think that is the case across many conflict zones, is a discourse of militarized masculinities in the realm of security, conflict resolution, peace building, and so on.
Thank you very much. Chehan, do you have anything to add what has been discussed, or do you want to answer any question?
All right. Okay. If I look at the first question from audience, it is who asked whether we may distinguish between flexible frontiers and fixed national borders. According to my presentation, Premodern and Postmodern can be counted as the flexible frontier, while the border can be counted as a fixed the border. But I would like to say, add one more thing to that. Actually, the national border, any border, is existing in political term, not in legal term. For instance, as you saw the picture of Roland, the DNG and JSA, you saw the wire fence, wall, right? But actually, as I said in my presentation, the MDL, military demarcation line, is a typical, type of a modern border and demarcation. But everybody believe there should be a wall or wide fence, but there is no wide fence. Actually, if you visit the Korean DMZ and find the wire fence, then there should be a wire fence, erected by the North or South government for just protecting some resident or some the monitoring and investigation. So in the legal term, which means the sense of the Korean Armistice Agreement, it's the international legal term. The fence should be apart from 2 kilometers far from the MDL, but most of the wire fence do not, lie over there. Just some fence just 1 kilometer from MDL, or the other fences lie about 30 kilometers from the MDL. So yes, so if I just I'd like to add that, so the border is fixed, but very existing politically. That's what I'm saying. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I hope everybody in this session can have a chance to visit Korean borderlines, to watch the kind of reality mixed of barbed wires and open field, only politically defined. Okay, Nimmy, do you have anything to add?
So I think there's a question by Patricia about border imperialism and how it squares with this notion of peace, or if I heard you correctly, if I recall correctly. So it's a very valid, it's a fair point. But what makes it particularly sinister and tricky really is how the state then leverages a lot of this securitization and militarization discourse in the name of producing peace. So it justifies and leverages the same securitization discourses in the name of creating peace. So it doesn't really; these are seen as being fundamentally, as being absolutely relevant. There's one more question from the chat box I can see from Turkey about whether these the borders and the walls that are coming up, whether these are temporary processes. A quick short answer would be no. These are, and one way to look at is to look at bordering itself as a practice, not really as as happening necessarily at the borders, but happening far away. And this pandemic has actually thrown up very disturbing, examples of how, whether it's racial profiling or the kind of us versus them, this entire social histories of prejudice that are getting, that it's giving a shot to. I think these are all really bordering practices that are getting a fillip.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And for viewers, there will be a feedback survey in the comment section of your YouTube channel. We would very much appreciate it if you could fill in that survey as well. So now we move on to Lily. Do you have any comments?
Thank you, Dr. Yi. I think I will follow on what Professor Nimmy, the question from Turkey in terms of the transformation and changes that happens in borders. And I think one of the critical issues we appreciate from all the presenters today is that apart from the challenges in the borderlands, there are opportunities. And I think for me, the transformation here would be basically looking at even our center's approach in terms of research and supporting in terms of programming. That as we look at these borderlands as creative spaces, what is the methodology? What is the approach we are going to use? And I think looking at research and programming from the voices, from this potential that we have said, in the borderlands, these communities are resilient. So it will be very, very important to start from that point. So whatever research and analysis, we are carrying the voices, we are carrying the solutions from the people in the borderlands. And that way, I think we will then lift them from poverty and will also be able to contribute. Secondly, very quickly, the issue of policy. In most cases, the definition of border and borders is actually defined by national states policies, national states frameworks. So I think it will be also quite useful to be able to intervene in terms of working with the authorities within borders and within these borderlands to be able to come up with policies that actually inform the way this issue of bringing development or bringing order, as the first presenter said, so that in a manner there is a way of inclusiveness and also ensuring that it benefits those we say are being found in this borderland. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think it was a small session, but we certainly carried the big voice about solutions to borderlands issues. Now we have to close the session. Thank you so much for presenters, first of all, and participants in the YouTube channel. In particular, I'd like to thank interpreters and all those staffs involved in managing these Zoom platform and YouTube channels. The second session will start at 1 p.m. in Greenwich Mean Time and 10 p.m. in Seoul time. Look forward to seeing you all in the second session. Thank you so much. Bye-bye, everybody.
Dr. Il-Changi for moderating the session and all the 6 presenters from all around the world for their valuable insights. I believe that wraps up the first session. Session 2 will be in a few hours. The topic will be Peace by Peaceful Means in Borderlands, and it will start at 10 p.m. Korea time and 1 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time. Please join us then. We look forward to seeing you then.